to welcome everyone to another webinar from the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership. And we invited, and I'm so delighted that Stephen Pitt-Walker, based in Sydney, Australia, agreed to give us insights into the benefits of having cognitive diversity on the board. Stephen is, I hope that you will take a look at Stephen's LinkedIn profile at some point. It's just impossible to summarize everything that Stephen has accomplished. Well, it's true, Stephen. Let's see. You're a lawyer. You're an author. You're a consultant. You're a board expert. You have a military background. I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself, because I'll never be able to do justice to your background. I know. So.
I think you've captured me already there, John. Thanks very much. You know, some would say a master generalist, some would say jack of all trades and master of none. I think, however, I would probably argue myself that in my career, and you've set that out somewhat from my early stages in going through the Royal Military College of Australia, becoming a military officer. Clearly that was a leadership potential role, and developed leadership and then exercised leadership at an early age. And I think from there, that's where I began my academic career as well. When I left the military and went into the private sector, it was with a view of service. And I think the service aspect runs through as a golden thread through my career. And so whether that was in the private sector in my first management consulting role, all the way through to the managed services, the international management of global managed services, organizations and accounts, whether that was in high tech or otherwise, mining and resources, usually with a tech focus though. So my background is tech, or whether it was in strategic advisory firms, as a more senior executive and also practitioner, and then lawyer as well. And I thoroughly enjoy academia as well. So yes. It's had a special place. And I think some of the people that I've met along the way, and that's really the journey of all of us, is the people that we meet and the giants upon whose shoulders we stand. So I think that's been key to what's led me along the journey. And it doesn't seem necessarily that it's straightforward, but it's always been people related. So whether it was into academia as an adjunct professor, or whether it was to legal services or human rights advocacy, there was always people related. And so the path meandered along the journey of the relationships that I formed as well. So that brings us up to present day, and now I operate a new company which I'm launching, which is called Optima Board Services Group, and we're doing advisory work in the board space. I'll maintain my company directorships and expand those possibly as well, or refresh those as we go. We'll talk a little bit about that refresh on boards and the importance of that as well in the seminar. At the same time as education. And I think, again, that's the academic space for me, linked to the practitioner space. So there's praxis, the theory into the execution. Yes. And that's exceptionally important, as the Bonar Institute knows, and as we've discussed as well, that these things are connected. So what we're doing today as well is connecting some theory with practice, and looking for ways to best serve. And I use that term service, or serve again.
Yes. Stephen, I wanted to note I've made you host so that you can share your screen. And while you're in the process, you stimulated a thought. If you actually go back to the 1600s and 1700s, when corporate governance was just getting started by the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and coming to the US, When corporation statutes were first enacted, and I think the first in the United States was in Boston, corporations actually had to serve a public purpose. That was that was the only way that you could start a corporation. And some would argue today that that connection has been forgotten. So very interesting.
And you know, John, that might be a really nice point to begin with. The Dutch East India companies, the Royal Charter companies, we might call those, whether the British or the Dutch, and the idea of purpose. I think that the debate that you're alluding to there is the debate over the purpose of business. You know, why are we in business? And I think that's become more extraordinarily polemical recently. And so what the purpose of the business is and what the purpose of the organs of the corporation are have come into question as well. Whether the purpose of business, and it's a very low bar that was set in respect of the public service that was required. I think that's developed over time. But also today what we have is a corporate environment which has moved very far away from the ideals of public service to an extent, as we know. Mm-hmm. And so on one pole, we have those who believe in the somewhat corrupted version of, not corrupt, but corrupted understanding of the Milton Friedman perspective on profit maximization. And on the other pole, we have those who are ardently pushing for the social purpose of business. So business as a reflection of society and for social utility. I think what we're looking at today in terms of diversity in all its senses, cognitive diversity as well, and we will focus on that, is a reflection of this debate over the purpose of business. And so I think it becomes ideological, but at the same time, I think we've observed before, John, in discussion, that Friedman hasn't been well understood. And so there are aspects of Friedman that could be developed further in terms of regulation and some in terms of understanding of him, but also balancing him. And I think the word balance is very important here as well. So that it kind of introduces and contextualizes the discussion somewhat. And I'll just hop right in. I have put an introduction in there, so if anyone looks at the recording, you can pause and have a look at that, but we're going to jump right in here now and start looking at what is cognitive diversity. The very first thing, I thought that we should define some terms. So cognitive diversity, defined as a range of differences in how individuals perceive, process, interpret information based on their unique backgrounds, experiences, perspectives, upbringings, and also schema, what psychologists might call schema, the way that we view the world, that platform that allows us to understand the world. It includes differences in thinking styles, problem-solving approaches, communication styles, and it encompasses a wide range of factors beyond demographic diversity. Now, those factors can include things like, but not limited to, education, skills, personality traits, cultural background, and also family background too, I think is an important one to put in there, because our childhoods and our context tend to dictate a lot of the way that we see the world as well. The concept recognizes that embracing and leveraging those differences can bring benefits to teams and organizations. And those benefits include increased creativity, better decision-making, and more comprehensive understanding of complex problems. Clearly, there's some allusion there to how the board is impacted by cognitive diversity or a lack of cognitive diversity. So in comparison to cognitive diversity, demographic diversity refers to the differences among people in various forms, gender, age, ethnicity, race, sexual preference, those sorts of things. You might also term this socio-political, socio-economic, or socio-political diversity. It's often discussed today in terms of promoting equality, justice, and inclusion. And we hear that term diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, for all members of society. The goal here is to create a society where all individuals and groups have equal access to opportunities, resources, and I would add in there justice. John, you're a lawyer as well, and so access to justice issues are equally important. That's an economic concern as much as anything else as well, regardless of their background or identity. This also clearly has some allusion to the boardroom. DEI often refers to, in a corporate sense, or a public policy sense, to a set of practices, policies, and attitudes that promote the acceptance and inclusion of individuals from diverse backgrounds and identities, or with diverse identities. It involves creating a workplace or a community that values and respects difference in race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, and abilities, and more. I think, John, we talked about this when we were discussing the webinar, and it's worth making this comment here. I'm going to draw you into this one as well, because you started off, and we kind of talked about a little bit the context, and it's worthy of note that there's a logical and material connection, and I'll come back to the material. But talk about the logical connection between the composition of boards and the firms that they serve and their stakeholders and the societal context. Because stakeholders, key stakeholders today may be defined in part as the social context within which the corporation is embedded. So clearly the corporation today, and we've seen a lot of activism, consumer activism, for example, and a lot of companies coming under a lot of social scrutiny at the same time as having battles, and we'll come back to these battles, and I think it's reasonable to call them those, battles with government over policy concerns, more especially in the United States, which is probably the archetype for the confrontation between the two views, the Friedman market orientation and the social good and somewhat regulatory environment. Which is much different in the US. John, if you'd like to make a comment there about the connection between stakeholders and the composition of boards.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I think it's a much more nuanced and complex conversation, because if you look, there are some jurisdictions, or I'll call them countries in the world, that are organized around an ethnic group or a religious group. And it is expected in those jurisdictions that boards of businesses reflect those stakeholder groups, the ethnicity of the nation state or the religion of the nation state. And then you have the other countries that are not organized around religion or an ethnicity. And then the broader question becomes, well, to what degree are the stakeholders represented in the board, and do they need to be represented in the board? And I think what is very interesting is the NASDAQ, the stock exchanges around the world. Some of them are calling for different types of diversity, and certainly encouraging enough diversity on boards to achieve debate and discussion, meaningful challenges to the C-suite, the CEO, for example, in setting strategy. So it is very interesting, but that key question becomes, well, who are your stakeholders? That's number one. That is the number one question. There is disagreement about who are the stakeholders of a business. And then number two, there's certainly debate and disagreement about, well, which stakeholders need representation? And the representation could be, for example, if employees are a stakeholder in the board, then there needs to be human resource or talent management expertise in the board. If you are in a specific industry, does the board need to have expertise in that particular industry? If your business serves multiple ethnicities in a particular country, or let's say does business in multiple countries, How is that, does that need to be reflected in the board? Those are interesting and complex questions.
You raised some really great points there. I think that there are many, things are flicking into my head. The
Yeah.
example of one of the pharma companies in the US that was managed by a CEO. And this is a question for the board, because the board makes these decisions or approves these strategy decisions
Yes.
for example, inversion, whether to take the company outside the United States to get a tax advantage, for example, for shareholders, ostensibly, but the rationale being put was a diversification and diversity, and it would be good for key stakeholders, one of which is clearly a legitimate one in this instance because it's internal, is the employees. In the end, though, the share price fell significantly after that was executed, and the board was effectively moved out of the United States to another country where different decisions could be made much more liberally in terms of the board's favour. And that impacted also the employee groups, who were then suffering because it affected their 401ks and decisions about that. It affected, for example, how many layoffs there were going to be and things like that. I think these are really interesting questions, but behind that, your best question, I think, is what constitutes reasonable diversity on the board, legitimate stakeholder representation on the board. The term legitimate is applied because in this instance, and I think it's reasonable to do so, in this instance, we're talking about a corporation which is a very specific group, a very specific organization within society, and there are rules that govern that specifically as well. And that question is difficult to answer. And I think it's great that you raised the issue of the NASDAQ there, and we can extrapolate that around the world too. The word stakeholder, for example, in listing rules for the Australian Stock Exchange used to be mentioned 47 times. Today, the word stakeholder does not appear in the listing rules or guidelines of the Australian Stock Exchange, nor does it appear in Australian legislation in corporate law. And yet we have, as you allude, other places such as Dutch law, which elevate stakeholders to the same equitable position and consideration for the board as shareholders. So we've got a very broad gambit there, and I know Australia is a reflection of Delaware law in the United States, where we still hold the shareholder prime as the prime party, or the prime agent, or the prime concern for the board in agency theory. So lots of really good issues there. I think the other one that to mention is in the form of demographic diversity is the gender diversity issue reflected through NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, and one of the smaller but still very large exchanges in the United States, which has now quotas for females on boards as well. So they're all things to bear in mind as we're going through the presentation here, and then come to some discussion of that.
Mm-hmm.
Just to mention, Australia, again, slightly different. We tend with representation not to be particularly good, but we don't have rules around that, nor do our institutions like the ASX support having quotas and those sorts of things. We'll come back to some of those issues.
So, Stephen, can you cover a little bit more? Oh, yes. Well, here you are. The essential importance of cognitive diversity to achieve high-performing boards. I think that is a very important connection that you're bringing out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key. That's the key imperative. If there's an imperative for cognitive diversity, it's to make boards perform better. And I'll just go through. I just started going through now. I guess we've gone conversational, and I didn't intend to do that quite so quickly.
Yeah.
But very relevant nonetheless. So Epstein and Roy talk about high performance boards, and that they have to achieve 3 core objects. Those objects being to provide superior strategic guidance, the company's growth and prosperity. I think compliance should be added into there as well, that we make sure we're doing the right thing in terms of regulatory compliance, and to some degree ethical compliance in a CSR, a corporate social responsibility sense too, hopefully, though that hence self-regulation, I think personally doesn't work. We need to regulate quite a bit more, and also to for the board to move in terms of stakeholder understanding. Two, to ensure accountability to company's stakeholder to its company's stakeholders, key stakeholders in particular. I've listed some there. There's more than that as well. So shareholders, employees, customers, suppliers, regulators, the community, the government. But also, I think if we think in terms of the triple bottom line today, then people and planet need to be included in there some way as well. Three, ensure that a highly qualified executive team is managing the company, a professional team, and that there's all sorts of things like succession planning and pipeline development, all of those sorts of things to ensure the company continues to perform well. And four, this is one of my additions, which is that superior problem solving and decision making is maintained. Mm-hmm. So the current emphasis, a little bit of a busy slide, but I thought I would leave it that way simply so that people who were stopping and starting could the recording at a later date could see this. So from the literature of the moment, the core emphasis of the board, the corporation, in other words, remembering that the core organs of the corporation are the shareholders, members, and the board links the shareholders' interests to governance of management for achievement of the strategic objectives of the firm, the agreed strategic objectives of the firm. So the conventional discourses emphasize the importance of establishing correct processes and principles for corporate governance. This is often not well understood in itself, though. However, this is somewhat narrow a focus and has limited our understanding of teamwork, excellence, and board members. So we tend to see as a board inside a box. And it's not strange, because it delimits for us what could be an overwhelming task. But only through effective teamwork can boards leverage its distributed competence to manage both its monitoring and oversight, as well as its strategic guidance functions successfully, those being the two major functions of the board: strategic advisory and monitoring and supervisory. Excellent boards rely on critical interrogatory and solution-oriented thinking. To succeed, boards must be willing to learn from their failures, practice reflexivity, and consider issues from multiple perspectives. This is facilitated, all of that is facilitated by a high degree of cognitive diversity, awareness, openness, and humility, acknowledging that no individual possesses complete knowledge and no individual group possesses complete knowledge.
So Stephen,
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
well,
please.
I have a question to kind of stretch our thinking.
Yes.
Suppose we have a global business, and we have examples of global businesses having capitalization several times larger than the GDP of many countries in the world.
Yes.
And the board of directors represents a majority of the members are a single gender, a single racial classification, similar educational background, from the same country, speaking the same native language, having a similar religion. Can such a board that seemingly is not diverse, can such a board achieve cognitive diversity? Now, we know that cognitive diversity is not required in law. There's no statute, there's no regulation. Here's an interesting one. UK Financial Reporting Council. I don't know if that's binding guidance or not, but I'm curious.
It's non-binding guidance. As we remember, the binding guidance in the United Kingdom, for example, is Section 172 of their Corporations Act,
Yes.
Which says that effectively the corporation can do, this is a serious paraphrase, the board can effectively do whatever it needs to do to the extent that it needs to do it, and it can consider stakeholders. That
Yes.
might include for the board and board diversity, to the extent that it doesn't conflict with the primary purpose, which is to act in the interests of the shareholder. So it's non-binding, but we've got these movements today in terms of what real diversity is and how to bring better, greater experience, understanding, diverse thinking, mental models to the corporation and corporate decision-making, so that we can achieve not, greater stakeholder understanding and service, but also to, the first time I've mentioned the balance word here, but it's a really important word to me, and it runs as a thread through every decision that we should be making at the board, to balance key stakeholder agendas and interests so that we make decisions for the present, the medium term, and the long term, and that's value creation. And we'll come to some of those issues as we progress as well. So I think it's a great point. You also raised a point earlier about global corporations and how they can behave in respect of a global audience and a global key stakeholder base, really focused in terms of the board's construct within a particular jurisdiction in society. I think that's a really important issue to understand as well. And I think boards need to, therefore, if they are a global or multinational corporation, to some extent take either advice formally and formalize a policy and process for doing so, or they need to be inclusive of their stakeholder groups from their major markets, for example, and also in respect of their major impact as well, and that's social and planetary. So these are really interesting points.
So, Stephen, if I have a board that is not diverse in terms of gender, country of origin, can we as a board do something to become cognitively diverse quickly?
Yeah,
I don't want to stray from your presentation, but I wanted to introduce that question as we
look. And I think it's a major one, and we do come to this in some of my examples.
Yes.
And we've got some really great examples to choose from today, very recent, very topical. Yeah. So we've got the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. We've got the, for example, Credit Suisse and UBS acquisition. And I think that might show us that there's a little bit of jumping from the frying pan into the fire. But if we can hold that thought and come back to it, John, we'll discuss it for sure. Yes. And it's very, very important to this. And your question was, is it important to have cognitive diversity? And if it is important to have cognitive diversity, how can we ensure within a micro environment, such as a board, a micro team, that we apply the principles of cognitive diversity? And there's a few ways, and we'll come to that. So if we just press on a little bit, and I might start skipping through a little bit more quickly, being very aware of time, and we come to some of those so that we can have some discussion around them too. So very briefly here, cognitive diversity, the rationale for it is because it leads to better problem solving, decision making, innovation in organizations. How do you innovate in an organization without cognitive diversity? Very, very difficult. We see the IDEO example of innovative thinking, design thinking, for example, and the reason that they pull different people into the room and say, here's a problem, go, and there's no limits on your thinking, is exactly this issue. So it also avoids groupthink, a very important issue here. We'll come back to that. And it improves communication. As long as there's a charter, there's rules, and there's good leadership and maturity and some wisdom on the board, I think that we can have diverse boards. I often hear discussions where we can't have diverse boards because it's a blocker to decision making, because people become there's an animus within the board because of the differences. I think that's ridiculous. We live in societies where we need to be more cognizant and understanding and accepting of differences, so that we know, again, looping back to the point, that we aren't the font of all knowledge, that we also have our biases. We come to this quite soon. So as that last point there, in summary, cognitive diversity is important for promoting innovation, creativity, effective problem solving, diverse problem solving, brainstorming, for example, and effective decision making off that once you've considered all angles. Very important in today's marketplace, as well as, and that's the marketplace of ideas, not just the marketplace of commerciality.
I wanted to note, Bira has raised his hand for a question. Bira, we'd love to have your question. Or comment.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and thank you, John. I don't know if it's time for questions, but it's just a curiosity. Brilliant presentation so far, Stephen. But as you just touched the cognitive biases, this is one of my major problems. When you are dealing with the board, you get their personal profile with skills and education and all of that, but no one puts in their CV their biases. So this is the most important.
I agree. I agree.
How can you deal with that? How can you determine all these biases when it's just a conversation between you and me? You can know each other for, I don't know, 100 years, so I can get a good grasp on your biases. But when you are in a larger group, biases, can be very destructive sometimes and can turn the board in a very toxic environment. I don't know if you are going to discuss this, but I think this is a very interesting point, to me to be discussed, if you have time for that. Thank you.
Look, I think I'll just, given that you've raised the point, and it's an exceptionally important issue. And I think it's the most important, as you allude, Bira, it's the most important issue for management on the board, to be managed by the board. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is through recognition of it, acknowledgement of it, and that it has some policies and processes set up in the board charter, and that then there's an element of leadership. And I think that, the Bonar Institute's purposeful leadership guidance is important here as well, that you must have this as a purpose. You must, with intentionality, in inverted commas, understand that everybody has a bias. We all have biases and blind spots. It's the way that we're constructed. It's the way that our brains work. And there's neuroscientific evidence of this. There's also, beyond that, there's cognitive evidence of that in terms of the research from psychology as well. And I know that there's some flex in those because they're not sometimes understood well, and it's such a broad space. It's difficult to put a very fine point on this. Nonetheless, I think it's apparent. I think that it's very apparent that we can't be all things in ourselves, and we can't completely balance ourselves. None of us can. And so, we all work on our schema, in other words, assumptions. And the line there from Alan Alda, your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while or the light won't come in. I think we need to think like that on the board. So what are some of those, just to expand on that very quickly, what you said there, Bira, in terms of the cognitive biases and how we work. And also to look back to what John asked previously, which was, if we've got a single mind, if you will, or a more singular mind, how do we then remove that or diversify that on the board? Or should we do that? Well, yes, we absolutely should, because we can't operate effectively in a global environment in particular, and everybody's global today. And we need more understanding as opposed to less, certainly in terms of geopolitical risk, in terms of geopolitical management, in terms of cultural acceptance and sensitivity. And I think this line from Maslow is really important here. And I like the reflection through Calvin and Hobbes. I always liked this, even before I understood what it meant in as much detail as I do today. If the only tool that you have is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as a nail. So, and it's, I think there's also the comic strip there. I have a hammer, Calvin. I can knock things together, knock them apart and alter my environment at will, and I can make an incredible din all the while. You know what? The more I read this comic, the more I think, wow, it's really deep, because it's very patriarchal as well. And I don't mean to labor that point from any ideological perspective, but nonetheless, we need to observe it. And it's great to be male. I've got the hammer. So if you put a group of males in a room who only have a hammer, and if we consider the hammer a metaphor for our way of thinking, our mental model, then the only way they can solve problems is with the hammer. The only way they can make decisions is with the hammer. Some of the cognitive biases that Vero, you were alluding to, which are really important to understand, and I don't know that I'll explain all of them. Time is getting on, but nonetheless, we see all of these biases reflected in the boardroom. I know I do, and I will be guilty of this as well. So I need people around me who are going to open a window for me and say, hey, look out there. Alan Alda, look out there, look at that window. You know what, that's really interesting, because from this point of view, yeah, but from that point of view, no. Let's balance this. I come back to my word balance. So we've got things like confirmation bias, complexity bias, simplicity bias, anchoring bias, hindsight bias. These are all in survivor bias, as well as our blind spots. And we will all utilize those at some stage. And, if we just pick one there, the hindsight bias, to dwell on a little bit there, perhaps, in terms of corporate functioning, in terms of corporate strategy, then it's really easy to get hung up on what we look back on and to say that was really successful. And we behaved in these ways and we did these things and they were really successful. And if we're yellow pages in Australia, for example, to use an Australian example, Kodak is another example of this, of course, this thinking, this mental model that we had, then, we don't need to change. We just need to do better what we've done in the past. We need to be more efficient. We need to be more effective in our ways, whereas actually the ways needed to change completely because the context had changed, technology had changed, the internet had come about. And so yellow pages needed to pay attention to that. And they went from a valuation in Australia of, I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of $200 million. And over a period of just a few years, couldn't sell the company for anything more than $9 million because they hadn't taken regard of the changes. There's a cognitive bias that led to strategic drift and doing strategy the same way, just trying to do it better. So we needed to open a window on that. I know it's quite an obvious example, but it wasn't obvious to them. And that's the interesting point. And I think all of the biases there are indicative of these things. Andrew, you had your hand up.
Yeah, you mentioned Australia, and I think one of the very Australian problems we see here is the mythology of the glorious past. You talk about hindsight, we've turned it into an art form. Unless you've lived there, people will tell you that it was so much better then. And you sort of go, no, it wasn't, but it was. And there is that lack of learning, that unwillingness to embrace ideas. If you talk about cognitive thinking as in a group, corporation, or a body, even a church, people will throw their hands in the because it was so much better in the old days. We knew where we stood.
Yeah. Yes, this is the issue indeed. I think that mythologizing of the past or glorification is very easy to do, particularly again when you have been successful in the past, or when your perception is that things were better in the past, which is what you're talking about there. And we have a tendency to be selective. This is selective memory as well, which is another form of bias. We remember only the good. We tend to downplay the negatives. And we also, I mean, in a period of great change today, extraordinarily rapid change socially as well as technologically, one drives the other two, arguably. We're going to need to deal with this because we've got the tension between, for example, today, generative AI and people saying, well, you know, we're going there. The genie's out of the bottle, so we need to manage it and we need to take opportunity to leverage it. Others who are saying, you know, even some of the leads, and I question their motives at times, but nonetheless, it's been stated, we should put a pause on that. Now, the reason for putting a pause on it is probably clear and reasonable in terms of producing a regulated, somewhat regulated, self-regulated, and maybe also a regulatory environment, such as the one coming out of the EU for artificial intelligence ethics. Absolutely necessary in so many places. But at the same time, the genie's out of the bottle, as I said, and we can't afford to wait. And there's some real positives that come out of the application of artificial intelligence. So I think there's some tensions here, and we do come to that further on. There's tensions in the mind, and I think it's really important to understand that we're dealing with these tensions. In fact, I might zip down there, and we've seen the biases. What I'll do actually is go back so that just very quickly some of the slides can be viewed by people, but we might in the recording so just leave that, and there's some very quick explanations of what they are there, though I think the explanations are clear. So biases, blind spots, and heuristics, all of those, and sometimes heuristics are not so bad because even though they're anecdotal, they do tell a story. And if we think of Daniel Kahneman as well, thinking fast and thinking slow, we need both of those forms of thinking.
Indeed, artificial intelligence creates heuristics, and then programmers deliberately introduce heuristics into artificial intelligence for efficiency.
Through the algorithm.
So we're going to be stuck with them no matter what.
And so we need a way of managing and digesting and then deciding or sifting, putting them through a sieve, these things through a sieve. It's like Chat GPT, you know, you can use it, but oftentimes it will give you wrong information, absolutely wrong information. So, you know, if you ask Chat GPT, for example, or Bard, it doesn't matter which, they're all of a kind. So if you ask it about the impact, as I did, the impact of the board on the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, it will tell you that the Silicon Valley Bank, I apologize, but I have to tell you, Silicon Valley Bank has not collapsed. It's doing fine, and its reporting is this and that. And, you know, so it's not nuanced at all. And so we have to have ways of managing that. I guess we'll get better, but we need to have principles that we apply. We need to think there's an awful lot. And I know, John, you've done a lot of work in the AI space, as have I, over 18 months. I'm not as engaged anymore, but I did an 18-month policy examination for a large corporation in this space about how it could use, and also how it needed to monitor and give guidance over and put guardrails in place for the use of its artificial intelligence capabilities. And I think that's something which is going to be more and more difficult, but again, and difficult because it's got a multiplier effect, particularly when you take it across jurisdictions. And it's not like necessarily like privacy, where you can have a framework like GDPR. It's not that simple. It's just not quite as simple as that. And that's a difficult one too. So yeah, we've got to manage the tension between innovation, and these are always tensions that we're managing: innovation, our thinking, and our cognitive biases as they play into our thinking. And so diversity, cognitive diversity, is a very important aspect of that, inclusive of ethnic diversity, inclusive of the ways other people think. Your point about a jurisdiction and a society where the company comes out of that has a board in that space, in that jurisdiction, for example, which is governed in that and regulated in that jurisdiction, but provides services globally. These are really interesting issues, particularly when it comes to intangibles, such as artificial intelligence, generative language, more independent thinking of machines. So I'll leave that up for a second so people can stop on that one. Stereotyping. So we've got prejudices as well. We're discriminating in a negative way, sometimes in a positive way. We produce self-fulfilling prophecies, and we stigmatize all sorts of things because they're outside of the norm, because they're outside of our referential space, because they're different, because they're the other. In many, many ways, we all know the ways that we do that. Sexual orientation, LGBTIQ issues. And that's not to say that the majoritarianism that we reflect as a normative dominant group necessarily needs to be countered by having minorities who are in control. I don't believe that that's what cognitive diversity or diversity DEI even is looking to do. It's, there's often this case of weaponization and ideological politicization. I don't think that's the important factor, and I don't think anyone's actually trying to do that. I think it's a matter of equity, not necessarily even equality, but equity. And so equity on the board can be something that we strive for with intention as well, because if we don't, then like everybody else, including ourselves, we just won't think of it because we have our schema, we have our mental model and our dominant logic. This is what we need to be very intentionally, as a principle, seeking to avoid, so that we get the benefits that we've already seen outlined from cognitive diversity in problem solving and decision making. And hopefully we can add to our already, hopefully, vast stores of wisdom and maturity and experience by balancing cognitive diversity and diverse positions and acceptance of the other in that space as well. It's a little bit hard though, because if we look at Niklas Luhmann, who was a prolific and highly respected, and I mean in Europe today, even though he hasn't been transliterated into English, unfortunately, I was fortunate enough to be working with an excellent scholar and CEO in the Netherlands over some years, and he introduced me to the writings of Luhmann and the ideas of Luhmann. Luhmann talked about complex social systems and cultural codification and the way that works, and in small groups, these micro environments, if you will. And the idea effectively is, or at its root, is that from the biology framework, we can apply that into from the organism into the organization or small group, within which groups become autopoietic. In other words, they become self-referential. They develop a culture and a mindset, and the group has that mindset, and that it's very hard to get outside of that. Some more work was developed on that basis in the Nyenrode Business Unit, or from the Nyenrode Business University in the Netherlands, where there was action-based research done on innovation and the innovation problem. And the issue was that introducing new ideas was attacked in terms of the immune system of the organization, because a different idea wasn't self-referential. It wasn't referencing the cultural norms or the normative behaviors and understandings of the corporation, nor of the board itself. So again, there is a requirement for some serious and deep intentionality with respect to these sorts of things. And I think, as I've said there, you know, and I'm often annoyed with the statement, the way things get done around here. This is just the way we do things around here. People throw that around a lot. And I think that while it can be good if you have established great values and some real intentionality about certain principles, if you haven't done that and the corporation is just behaving, then the behaviors can be exceptionally negative. So it's a very finely honed double edge. And as I said there, if Drucker was right and culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think there's some caveats that need to be put on that as well in terms of understanding strategy and decision making. But if it does, then clearly establishing a strong, cohesive and effective culture may also be a real problem in terms of cognitive diversity and diverse thinking and breaking out of mental models that create issues. And as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem within the same mind that created it. Mm-hmm. So my hypothesis there is, if Einstein was right, then boards must seek cognitive diversity and value the maintenance of its affected and of its effect, and refresh regularly to avoid the effects of autopoiesis. And what they found in the action research in the Netherlands, that once you had innovated, you create something separate and you innovate, because you don't want the standard or the standing majoritarian culture to influence or affect the innovation that you're trying to achieve. Once that had happened, it developed a self-referential thinking model as well, and could no longer innovate either. It's an interesting problem. Groupthink. So this is another issue of having a very similar mindset in the board. And I don't want to necessarily read that, because I want to have some more discussion and time's getting away. John, how much time have we got now?
Officially, we have 5 minutes. It doesn't mean we have to end, but that is the official time to end. But okay. We frequently find that people stay on and discuss, but which we can do. We can continue.
Right. So I might continue as well, but I'll just sort of summarize here. So groupthink, and we've mentioned group thinking, which I think instead of, I'll leave the Janus 1972, which is the very academic definition there for people to look at. But groupthink being the type of thinking that when members of a group accept things by consensus uncritically. It's almost like the confirmation bias. We accept and we vote that way because that's the way we've always done things. That's the way we think. It's our schema. It's our mental model. So characteristics there: the belief in group wisdom, submission to group decisions, belief in group integrity, stereotyping outsiders, the existence of mind guards, very important one. And I think that's where the role of the chair of the board becomes exceptionally important in leadership, so that they're managing the mind guards, making sure that voice that's very strong is tamed a little bit and just kept at a reasonable level. It's not unreasonable to have that, but it certainly then leads to censorship if you have that voice being too loud. And so there's got to be a values orientation, a purpose orientation inside the board as well. So the board charter probably, in my mind, ought to create or have a purpose statement as well, a purpose statement for the board, some guiding principles for the board. Now, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The better ones certainly do. And then we've got self-censorship, which is, I think, exhibited in this cartoon as well. And we all know this. Anybody who's been on a board knows this. I'm sure I know that I have done it. I'm guilty. I'm absolutely guilty of having agreed and gone, yeah, I'm not going to buck that system. We do it in executive roles as well. Sitting around the decision table with the CEO or your peers when decisions are coming, I'm sure that we all do it. We sit and we think politically, what if I do this? And you think to yourself, no, you know what, it's not appropriate for me. You know, we don't couch it in terms of our lack of moral courage. I think what we do, and not unreasonably so, is couch it in terms of our self-preservation to some extent. But we need to manage this. These things need to be managed, and there are ways of doing that. Some of the examples of where we've gotten this, back to your question, John, about the microenvironment that's very similar, and I've just got a few examples here. I won't go through all of them though. And if you bear with me, the 8 to 10 and the 10 to 12s and the numbers, some of those things are just prompts and aid memoir for myself. So if we look at the Credit Suisse, near collapsed. It would have collapsed had it not been bailed out and purchased by UBS, for example. In the board at Credit Suisse, from my research, there are 10 board members, which is a good number, I think, for the organization. It's not too big, it's not too small. But 8 out of 10 of the board members at Credit Suisse only had banking and finance industry experience. 8 out of 10. Of the board, slightly less than 50% of them are women. That's pretty good. That's good gender diversity in this instance. But again, all of the females had banking and finance backgrounds, and of those 8 who did have banking and finance backgrounds, only half of them only had worked in Credit Suisse. If we look at the UBS board, the purchaser, the acquirer of Credit Suisse, 10 of 12 only. They actually, on the gender diversity basis, they're slightly more than 50%, so they do very well. But again, only 10 of 12 only had banking and finance backgrounds. And again, half of those only in UBS. And most of them are Caucasian as well. We look at Wells Fargo, very similar story, 10 to 14. 10 of 14, only banking and finance backgrounds. This predominance, and therefore I make the leap, or I draw the inference that dominant logic exists in those boards. And that's not in terms of a gender inequity, but a banking and finance mental model where the only measures are financial gains. And doing that becomes an art form. Financial engineering becomes an art form, but it becomes problematic as well. So what we have is, even with some demographic diversity in operation, we still have a lack of cognitive diversity in those spaces, arguably. This is untested, certainly. I haven't done deep research, but prima facie, I think what we see here, and if we link it to the results, then we can see that there may have been an argument to include more diverse perspectives and understandings. You know, the fact is that on the Credit Suisse board, the Wells Fargo board, there is not a lawyer. There is no lawyer on those boards. I find that incredible, not because I'm a lawyer, but because there's a lack of that perspective, that thinking, that legal reasoning, which I'm sure John will join me in saying is an exceptionally particularistic, sometimes problematic, but nonetheless very different way of thinking. So, and there are Australian examples of that as well. In fact, Australia, generally speaking, we do better with boards in terms of gender diversity from my research than perhaps in the United States. Not as well as Europe at the moment, but still better than the US, where there's a system of quotas that has been introduced in some states. One of the issues, I think, for the US is that there is no federal act governing the corporation. It's another point and another issue, though. But in Optus, for example, we've had the recent issue of a very large and quite harmful cybersecurity attack, a ransomware attack. but it didn't turn out that any direct harm had taken place or had been affected by the hackers in the immediate term. The board clearly sanctioned the crisis management communication from the CEO, in which she said, and she's the only female member of that board, and they're all white. I should observe that. And they're all white middle-aged males from banking, from corporate backgrounds. So again, a corporate mindset. There's in fact a male member of the board who's in America, who's a US citizen who sits in America. There is no Australian Chinese. There is no Australian Asian. It's not a particularly reflective board as far as society goes. They are, however, a cognitively diverse group, much more so than Wells Fargo or Credit Suisse UBS in terms of their industry backgrounds. They have that in their favor. But the messaging was that there was no harm that has been befallen given the attack. Well, I think that was a very big claim. And clearly the board had approved that communication. If they hadn't, then that's another problem. But, we see these problems in Australia as well. The mental models, particularly the financial sector. We had a Royal Commission here that found extraordinarily egregious behaviours and misconduct in the banking sector. I would argue that today, having worked in the financial services sector as a senior executive in a strategic advisory firm looking after that sector vertical across the Asia Pacific in Australia and New Zealand as well, I don't think there's been an appreciable change in the mental model or the thinking or the understanding and the norms. It's so, again, there we seldom realize that the way that we're thinking is constructed. And we don't think that there's something outside of that until it's brought to our attention. So they're just some of the examples that we have. And so I think in terms of what the board can do, we need to challenge the effects of majoritarianism, of mental model narrowness, of a lack of cognitive diversity by introducing that. And how do we do that? We need to be intentional about it. We need to ensure that, for example, we have a strategy regarding the board composition and refresh cycle. We probably need board refresh to be something that's much more regular, and that we think about putting term limits on board positions. Because having somebody on your board who's been there for 20 years, with dispensation and a little bit of slack for founders, I think, which is reasonable. But otherwise, I think that that's very stultifying, or could be, certainly. And I think the tendency would be for it to be stultifying, very stifling, very same. So nominations committees need to be thinking about these things, as well as selection criteria. I'm not suggesting for a second that we dispose of selection criteria in terms of right fit for the business. We need the right skills. We need the right understandings to be able to make the right decisions. But we also need to recognize that once we have that, we don't need a greater preponderance of it. So that what we can do is diversify from there. And I think some of the more diverse boards have proven that results are better. And I think that the more that we do in terms of trying to create social positivity and positive long-term value creation for the business by being more diverse, which is something that Alex Edmonds argues in his book, Growing the Pie, and he does this based on research over 30 years, is that those organizations that do challenge the norms, that are more cognitively diverse, for example, he uses more broad analogies as well and more broad data, but they tend to be better performing. And that's in terms of share price. That's in terms of market volatility. May McDonald from the Wharton School argues the same. She goes further as well. But these sorts of things are really important. So, balancing selection based on experience and skills with or against cognitive diversity. Suit the requirements of the business, absolutely. Seek to reduce mental model limitations. Or sameness, just sameness.
probably end in about 3 minutes. That will be 10 minutes after the hour. And
Sure.
yes, I'd just like to suggest. So if there are other slides we could go. And I think this is the most important point is what can we do about achieving cognitive diversity?
So as has been alluded, purposeful leadership on the board, encouraging new and different ideas through positive onboarding processes, mentoring new members of boards, support for new members of boards, making sure that they have a voice, employing devil's advocacy or the Cartesian critic approach. Hopefully, along with maturity and wisdom, some discussions of what this means, of what cognitive diversity means for us on the board, reducing voices that are very loud by some discussions, maybe private discussions one-on-one, or discussions openly about the generalities, enhancing emotional intelligence and self-awareness, understanding also that as Joseph Schumpeter discussed, creative destruction is not a bad thing. So differences of opinions are not a bad thing. I think what we need to understand as well is that proximity, in other words, sameness, we like to work with people who are the same as us, that can be value destructive. So differentiation, diversity, can be value creative, avoiding strategic drift and some of the other concerns mentioned above. And if there's a unanimous decision, implementing a last man standing rule where somebody has to take the opposing view and argue it. I've mentioned those already. We've mentioned some of those already. So I think we're pretty much through that, John, and they're my concluding remarks, which is that if you don't, in terms of board composition and in a paradigm shifting era of change, if we don't think more diversely, if we don't implement cognitive diversity programs, policies, ways of behaving, norms, then probably you're at risk of becoming an anachronism, the board and the corporation. So that's where I'll leave it.
Well, Stephen, I'd like to thank you for presenting and introducing these ideas. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I do,
Yes.
if I may.
Yes.
Thank you, Stephen. It will certainly help me clean my windows, if I can put it that way. The question, I have a couple of questions. The first one is, does ESG create new requirements for the board in terms of diversity and cognitive diversity? And in what way, please? Could you comment on that?
So the answer to the first part of the question is yes, I believe it does. And I think that I would even step back from ESG, though it's an important factor. I would step slightly back from ESG and say sustainability. So the issue of sustainability, particularly external sustainability, externalities to the way that we've always thought about the corporation, and that the corporation and the board could make decisions in isolation based on its fiduciary obligations as they're prescribed by law. Today is different. And I would suggest that that's for a number of practical reasons and a number of ethical reasons as well. So in a practical sense, I don't think that we can avoid the fact, as we've alluded, that we operate in a global context and where the corporation and therefore the board is embedded within society. And so if we're not making decisions based on a much broader understanding of the world than exists, particularly in a very small group, often a rarefied group, which is very highly educated, it's limited even on that basis, limited by access to justice, access to resources, then we're not going to be able to make decisions in a world that's demanding much more of the corporation externally. The non-market lens and the non-market activism that we see today, for example, are clearly having an impact on corporate performance and are clearly having an impact on reputation. And in terms of reputation, Elliot Schreiber has written a great book on this, by the way, The Impact of Reputation, the yin yang of reputation, and what reputation actually means. And in it, he says it's not what you tell people you are. Your brand doesn't reflect what you tell people you are. It reflects rather what you do and who you are. So when you're walking the walk, it's much more important. I think we need to make sure that we're not just saying we're doing things. This is the image washing or greenwashing effect. We actually need to be doing those as well. So yes, ESG plays into that because ESG is a major mover in the market in terms of putting pressure on the corporation and the investor community to behave in certain ways. I don't think ESG as yet is mature enough nor consolidated enough, nor is it implemented well enough, or the requirements of it for audit and also behavior are implemented enough. That's a maturity factor to make it consequential in terms of real outcomes, sustainability outcomes. But nonetheless, that is the direction it's going. I hope it does. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, it does. I wonder if I may be allowed a second question. Somebody else may have another question. I'm happy to wait.
Please,
John, should I go ahead? Okay, thank you. It's the second question relates a little bit to what you talked about, John, at the start, where organizations in the 17th century had to have a purpose that linked to public service. So the question is, do purpose and values follow from board diversity, or does board diversity follow from purpose and values of the organization?
Wow, great question. Great question. I think to some extent both. So this is a chicken or the egg question.
Yes.
But I will land and say I think we need today, because we're passing from the era of boards which were genteel. They're no longer ceremonial boards, and we shouldn't be having ceremonial boards which are gentlemen's clubs, where we have a look at the papers and then retire to the drawing room for cigars and brandy and discuss how wonderful the business is or what the weather's been like. We're professionalizing the board, and this ought to be an aim. And so in that, I think there's an answer. So our professionalization should lead to some improvements in that space. That's the way I look at that. And so that probably encapsulates my answer. It's that, yes, there's some purpose and values that weren't there. Today, we need to be much more intentional about documenting, probably discussing our values and our purpose, yes, and what the purpose actually is. And so I think it does stem, and I do land on it, does stem from a very formalized, a much more formalized process of A, professionalization, and B, discussion and explication of purpose and values. Because if someone believes, and there are those who do, and there's a whole stripe across the spectrum of people who believe different things as well. But at one end, there are those who are profit maximizers. They're Milton Friedman-esque. They don't necessarily understand Friedman because they don't want regulation of the environment either, which he suggested to fill the gaps around or to regulate the environment around the corporation. But at the same time, there are those on the other end who want purpose and values and a social orientation and social utility to be the prime purpose of business. I think the answer is somewhere in between. I think we need regulation. We need government to play a role. We need the board to play a role, but the board's role today must be with intention. And that intention turns into action. It also influences the way that we make decisions around innovation, and that means the way that we make decisions around investment of our scarce resources inside the corporation, and enacting for an agency for our stakeholders, our key stakeholders, one of which, of course, is the shareholder.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Anyone else have a comment or a question?
The last question then is related to how to diagnose the problems in a board from within the board. And that's not easy. It's like diagnosing the forest by being a tree.
Yes.
It's a bit tricky. So I wonder if there are let's say perhaps set of KPIs and established processes that would actually assist boards in avoiding all the traps that you have mentioned.
Look, absolutely. And certainly, you know, one of the roles in advisory that I provide is review in that context as well. So I think getting some external help is probably good, particularly for boards who haven't developed as yet the capability within, self-assessment within, and haven't developed the architecture or the infrastructure that's required to engender and to enable cognitive diversity, which does overlap with demographic diversity clearly as well. You know, when we think of different ethnicity or different nationality representation on boards, that can be extremely relevant, because particularly in global businesses, we, as John alluded earlier, we need some of that. We need to understand that. It can be great to have a person from a not-for-profit green organization on your board, for example, when you need to engage green stakeholders, if you're an energy transition company. And I regard oil companies and energy providers of all types, other than renewables, or they are as well, include them all as energy transition companies, because they're all in transition. That's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So having those people on your boards is very important. But if you can't do that, then bringing external people in to provide advice and provide review and to do some investigation, and not with a view to being an executioner at all, but rather to be a provider of positive support and assistance to the board. I think that's relevant as well. I go back to the Einstein statement there on this one, which is that it's very difficult to resolve a problem from within the thinking that created it. But if we put an addendum to that, it's also very difficult to even define the problem. You can't, as you said, can't see the forest for the trees. So I think bringing diversity into the board is one way, and bringing diversity to the board as an adjunct or in an advisory capacity is another way. But I think you've got to be really careful about how you do that. So it's such a delicate issue that requires great care, tact, and diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that we end. We've gone quite a bit over the hour. This is a rich discussion. Bira, you have unmuted. Do you have a final comment or question?
Just to thank you, Stephen and Joan, for putting this together. As I mentioned in my message, you know, we need to have part 2 and part 3, perhaps, of this.
Stephen, you are invited.
Brilliant.
You are
Thank you
invited.
very much.
It's on the hook now.
Yes, you are invited. And I'd like to say that Bira will be presenting next month on purposeful boards as well.
Fantastic.
And Bira has a lot of board experience. And I would like to say on behalf of the Bonar Institute, thank you to everyone who participated today.